The forests of Western Germany were collapsing under the weight of advancing Allied forces. It was March 1945, and the Third Reich's final defensive lines were crumbling like paper in rain. Among the chaos of retreat stood Klaus, a 13-year-old boy, whose hands trembled as they gripped a Karabiner 98K rifle, a weapon designed for men, not children. Klaus had been pulled from his school desk only weeks before. The Volkssturm, Germany's last desperate attempt at defense, had conscripted boys and elderly men alike. He remembered his mother's tears as Nazi officials took him away, her voice breaking as she whispered prayers he could barely hear over the propaganda loudspeakers blaring promises of final victory. Now those promises felt like cruel jokes, the rifle's weight cut into his shoulder, the metal barrel extending far beyond what his thin frame could properly balance. Around him, men, some barely older than himself, dug frantically into frozen earth, creating defensive positions they all knew were meaningless. The sound of approaching American armor echoed through the bare trees like thunder announcing an inevitable storm. Klaus's commanding officer, a gaunt Wehrmacht sergeant missing 2 fingers from the Eastern Front, had stopped giving orders. He simply sat against a tree, smoking his last cigarette, staring at nothing. The boy wondered if this was what defeat looked like, not dramatic or heroic, but quiet and hollow. The American tanks appeared suddenly through the morning mist. Their engines roared with a confidence that spoke of unlimited fuel, unlimited ammunition, unlimited everything. Klaus's units scattered like frightened birds. Some threw down their weapons immediately. Others ran deeper into the forest. Klaus froze, his legs refusing to obey the panicked signals from his brain. A Sherman tank rolled to a stop 15 meters away. American soldiers emerged, weapons raised but not firing. They shouted commands in English, words Klaus didn't understand but whose meaning was crystal clear. His rifle fell from numb fingers into the mud. He raised his hands above his head, tears streaming down his dirt-covered face. An American sergeant approached, young himself but looking impossibly old compared to Klaus. The soldier's eyes widened when he saw the boy's face, barely covered by an oversized helmet. He said something to his companions, shaking his head in what seemed like disbelief or disgust, though Klaus couldn't tell if the disgust was directed at him or at those who had sent children to war. They zip-tied his wrists, not roughly but not gently either. Professional. Efficient. Klaus was herded together with other captured soldiers into a clearing. Some were his age. Others were men in their 60s. All shared the same expression of exhausted relief mixed with profound uncertainty about what came next. As trucks arrived to transport them away from the front lines, Klaus caught his reflection in a puddle. He barely recognized himself. The boy who had loved mathematics and collecting stamps seemed like a character from another lifetime. Now he was prisoner number among thousands, heading toward an unknown fate in American hands. The war's roar faded behind them as the truck rolled westward, leaving Klaus suspended between the nightmare he was escaping and the mystery of what awaited him in captivity. The truck convoy traveled for hours through devastated German countryside. Klaus watched through gaps in the canvas covering as they passed burned villages, abandoned military equipment, and endless columns of refugees moving in opposite directions. The February cold bit through his thin uniform, and his zip-tied wrists had lost feeling an hour ago. When they finally stopped, Klaus found himself at a massive temporary facility, rows upon rows of tents surrounded by barbed wire fencing. American MPs directed the new arrivals through processing stations with mechanical efficiency. The camp sprawled across former farmland, transformed into a city of canvas and mud that housed thousands of German prisoners. At the intake station, an American officer looked at Klaus's identification papers with visible surprise. The officer called over a translator, an older German-American soldier who asked Klaus his age in accented German. When Klaus answered 13, the translator and officer exchanged troubled glances. They spoke in English, their tone suggesting disagreement about procedures. Klaus was photographed, his possessions inventoried. He had nothing except a sodden handkerchief his mother had embroidered, and issued a thin blanket. Then came the separation. The younger prisoners, those who appeared under 16, were directed to a different section of the camp. Klaus counted at least 40 boys in his group, some looking barely 12 years old. Their designated area consisted of 8 large tents arranged in 2 rows. Inside, wooden pallets served as beds, each covered with a single blanket. A cast-iron stove sat in the center of each tent, though fuel seemed scarce. The wind howled through gaps in the canvas, making the cold almost unbearable. Klaus claimed a spot near the stove and observed his fellow prisoners. Most sat in stunned silence, processing their new reality. A few cried quietly, others whispered nervously among themselves, speculating about their fate. One boy, perhaps 14, still wore a Hitler Youth dagger on his belt. The guards apparently hadn't confiscated it yet, an oversight that would surely be corrected. The camp's atmosphere was strange, neither hostile nor welcoming. American guards patrolled the perimeters with rifles, but showed no particular aggression toward the prisoners. They seemed almost bored, performing their duties with bureaucratic indifference. This lack of obvious hatred confused Klaus. He had been taught that Americans were barbaric enemies who would show no mercy. As evening approached, guards distributed metal cups of thin soup and pieces of hard bread. The food was meager but edible. Klaus ate slowly, savoring each bite despite the bland taste. It was more than he'd eaten in days on the collapsing front lines. Night brought deeper cold. Boys huddled together for warmth, strangers becoming temporary brothers in survival. Klaus lay on his pallet, staring at the tent ceiling, listening to muffled sobs and whispered prayers. Outside, searchlights swept across the camp in regular patterns, and guards' boots crunched through frozen mud. He thought about his mother, wondering if she knew he was alive. He thought about his father, killed 2 years earlier at Stalingrad, a hero's death, the notification letter had said, though Klaus now wondered what that phrase truly meant. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by cold and fear and the strangeness of being neither soldier nor civilian, neither free nor condemned, existing in an uncertain limbo where tomorrow remained a terrifying mystery. Dawn arrived grey and bitter. Klaus woke to the sound of guards shouting commands and the metallic clang of food containers being distributed. The morning routine established itself quickly. Prisoners lined up for thin coffee and bread, used the primitive latrine facilities, then waited, always waiting, with nothing to do but think and worry. The first full day in the camp brought whispers. Rumors spread through the tents like wildfire, each more disturbing than the last. An older prisoner, perhaps 15, claimed he'd heard from adult prisoners in the adjacent section that the Americans were planning trials. War crimes tribunals. Everyone who had fought, regardless of age, would face judgment. Another boy insisted he'd overheard guards discussing executions. The Americans were supposedly furious about concentration camps being discovered across Germany, and retribution would be swift and merciless. Klaus felt his stomach tighten. He knew nothing about concentration camps. The propaganda had never mentioned such things, but the fear in the other boy's voice was contagious. By the second night, the anxiety had become unbearable. Boys gathered in tight circles, speaking in hushed tones about what they'd heard. Someone claimed that child soldiers were considered war criminals under international law. Another said the Americans would send them to work camps in Siberia, traded to the Soviets as slave labor. The stories grew darker and more elaborate with each retelling. Klaus tried to separate truth from panic-fueled fantasy, but he had no reference point. Everything he'd been taught about the enemy had proven unreliable. The Americans weren't the savage monsters described in Nazi propaganda, but that didn't mean they were merciful. Perhaps they were simply efficient, following protocols before delivering punishment. The third morning brought a new development. Guards entered the youth section and ordered everyone outside. The temperature had dropped further overnight, and frost covered everything in crystalline white. The boys assembled in ragged lines, shivering in inadequate clothing, breath-forming clouds in the frozen air. An American officer appeared with the translator. They walked slowly along the ranks, studying faces, occasionally asking questions through the interpreter. When they reached Klaus, the officer paused, looking at him with an expression Klaus couldn't decipher. Pity, perhaps, or disgust. The moment stretched unbearably before they moved on. After the inspection, the guards ordered the prisoners to remain in formation. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Boys began swaying from cold and fatigue, but no one dared break ranks. The uncertainty Was torture. Was this the beginning of their trial? Were they being prepared for transport elsewhere? Klaus noticed American soldiers gathering equipment near the camp's entrance. Trucks arrived. More guards assembled. The activity suggested something significant was about to happen, and every prisoner felt the weight of impending change. The boy next to Klaus, a thin youngster from Bavaria, began praying under his breath. Others joined, their voices creating a low murmur of desperate petitions to a God who seemed to have abandoned Germany entirely. Klaus wanted to pray too, but words wouldn't come. Fear had frozen something inside him, leaving only numb anticipation. Finally, after what felt like hours in the cold, guards began directing groups of prisoners toward the camp's central area. Klaus's group was among the first called. As they marched between tents, he noticed adult prisoners watching through fence gaps, their faces unreadable. Whatever was coming, it was happening now. The guards led Klaus's group toward a small clearing near the camp's administrative buildings. The march felt eternal, each step weighted with dread. Boys stumbled on frozen ground, their eyes darting nervously between guards and the unknown destination ahead. Some whispered final prayers. Others had gone silent, faces pale as winter sky. When they reached the clearing, Klaus's heart nearly stopped. A line of American soldiers stood waiting, their expressions stern and unreadable. Behind them sat wooden crates stamped with military markings. The scene had all the terrible formality of an execution ground. Klaus remembered stories he'd heard about firing squads, about prisoners lined up and shot without ceremony. His legs weakened. The boy next to him began trembling violently, whether from cold or terror. Klaus couldn't tell, perhaps both. A few prisoners in the back ranks looked ready to collapse. The guards positioned them in a semicircle, then stepped back, creating distance that felt both protective and ominous. An American officer stepped forward and spoke in English. The translator followed, but his German came slowly, as if he too was processing something unexpected. The words made no sense at first. Klaus's fear-clouded mind couldn't grasp their meaning. Then American soldiers began opening the wooden crates. Not weapons emerged, but bottles. Glass bottles filled with dark liquid, glistening with condensation despite the cold. Klaus recognized them from propaganda posters that had mocked American decadence, Coca-Cola bottles, symbols of capitalist excess. Confusion rippled through the prisoners. This couldn't be real. It had to be some cruel joke, a psychological torture before the real punishment began. But the soldiers kept unpacking, stacking bottles on makeshift tables alongside wrapped packages that smelled impossibly of fresh bread and cooked meat. The officer spoke again. The translator's voice cracked slightly as he explained that each prisoner would receive rations. Not punishment, but food. Real food. The Americans had determined that those under 16 would be reclassified, treated not as enemy combatants, but as children who'd been forced into war. Klaus didn't move. Couldn't move. His mind struggled to process this impossible reversal. Around him, other boys stood frozen in identical disbelief. The anticipated violence, the expected retribution, the justice they'd been certain would fall upon them. None of it was coming. A guard called the first prisoner forward. The boy approached hesitantly, as if walking toward a trap. An American soldier handed him a Coca-Cola bottle, already opened, and a package wrapped in waxed paper. The boy took them with shaking hands, staring at the items as if they might vanish or explode. Nothing happened. The boy wasn't shot, wasn't struck. He was simply directed to step aside, and the next prisoner was called forward. One by one, they approached. One by one, they received the same impossible gift. When Klaus's turn came, his feet moved automatically. The American soldier who handed him the bottle was young, maybe 20, and with kind eyes that seemed genuinely concerned. He said something in English Klaus didn't understand, but the tone was gentle, almost apologetic. The Coca-Cola bottle felt impossibly cold in Klaus's hand. The wrapped package was warm, heat seeping through paper into his frozen fingers. He stumbled back to his place in line, clutching both items like sacred relics, unable to comprehend what had just occurred. Around him, prisoners began opening their packages. The smell of real food filled the air: bread, cheese, processed meat. Some boys cried as they ate. Others laughed, sounds edged with hysteria. Klaus raised the Coca-Cola bottle to his lips with trembling hands. The liquid was cold, sweet, and utterly foreign to his palate. He'd never tasted anything like it. The bubbles fizzed against his tongue. The sugar rushed through his system like electricity. For a boy who'd survived on stale bread and watery soup for weeks, this single drink felt like a miracle. Around him, prisoners devoured their rations with desperate hunger. The bread was soft, impossibly white compared to the dense black bread of wartime Germany. The processed meat, though strange in texture, tasted better than anything Klaus remembered eating since before the war. Some boys ate so quickly they made themselves sick, their shrunken stomachs rebelling against sudden abundance. After the distribution, guards directed the group back toward their section, but the atmosphere had transformed completely. The tension that had suffocated them for days had evaporated, replaced by cautious relief and lingering disbelief. Boys spoke in animated whispers, sharing their astonishment, comparing the taste of Coca-Cola, wondering what this unexpected compassion meant for their future. The following morning brought more changes. American personnel arrived with clipboards and documents, accompanied by translators who conducted interviews with each young prisoner. They recorded names, ages, hometowns, and family information. Klaus answered mechanically, still half convinced this kindness was temporary, that punishment would eventually arrive, but it didn't. Instead, the classification process continued. Those identified as under 16 were officially separated from adult POWs and moved to a different section of the camp with slightly better conditions. New tents appeared, these with wooden floors that provided insulation from frozen ground. More blankets were distributed, genuine wool blankets, thick and warm. Medical personnel examined the boys, treating frostbite, malnutrition, and various injuries sustained during combat or capture. An American doctor looked at Klaus's hands, which bore cuts and bruises from handling weapons too large for him. The doctor cleaned the wounds carefully, applied ointment, and bandaged them with professional efficiency. He spoke softly in English throughout, and though Klaus understood nothing, the gentleness was unmistakable. Daily routines established themselves: morning roll call, breakfast distribution, work assignments. The tasks were simple: hauling firewood, distributing supplies, cleaning communal areas. Nothing demanding, nothing punitive, just enough activity to maintain camp order and give prisoners purpose. Klaus found himself assigned to the kitchen detail, helping distribute food to other prisoners. The work was easy, almost therapeutic in its simplicity. He appreciated the structure, the predictability. After months of chaos and violence on the collapsing front lines, this mundane routine felt like salvation. Evenings became quieter. Boys gathered around stoves, sharing stories about home, families, lives before the war consumed everything. Klaus learned that the thin boy from Bavaria had been a promising violin student. Another had worked in his father's bakery. They were children with interrupted childhoods, slowly remembering who they'd been before uniforms and rifles. At night, lying on his pallet beneath wool blankets, Klaus would take out the empty Coca-Cola bottle he'd saved. He'd hidden it under his bedding, a talisman of the moment everything changed. The glass caught firelight from the stove, glinting like amber. He still didn't understand why the Americans had shown mercy, but for the first time since his capture, Klaus allowed himself to believe he might survive this war. Winter gradually loosened its grip on the countryside. March brought longer days and temperatures that occasionally rose above freezing. The camp transformed with the season. Mud replaced frozen ground, making movement messier but somehow less hostile. Klaus had been a prisoner for nearly a month, and the initial terror had faded into something resembling acceptance. His daily routine became almost comfortable in its predictability. Wake at dawn to the guards, whistles, morning roll call in formation, breath no longer freezing in the air, breakfast of coffee, bread, and occasionally porridge. Then work assignments that filled the hours until evening meal and lights out. The rhythm was monotonous but safe, and safety had become Klaus's most precious commodity. The American guards remained professionally distant but not cruel. They enforced rules without brutality, maintained order without violence. Klaus began recognizing individual soldiers, the tall sergeant who always checked the stoves to ensure they had adequate fuel, the young private who sometimes shared cigarettes with older prisoners, the stern corporal who ran morning formations with military precision but never raised his voice unnecessarily. This impersonal kindness confused Klaus more than outright hostility would have. He'd been taught that enemies were supposed to hate each other, that war created absolute divisions between good and evil. But these Americans treated their prisoners not as monsters requiring punishment, but as problems requiring management. They provided food, shelter, medical care, not generously but adequately. They maintained order not through fear, but through routine. Klaus's work in the kitchen detail brought unexpected privileges. He saw food before others, understood supply patterns, occasionally received extra portions when distributions ran over. More importantly, the work kept him warm and gave him purpose. The head cook, an older American soldier named Sullivan, communicated through gestures and simple German words he'd picked up. He showed Klaus how to efficiently distribute rations, how to maintain cleanliness standards, how to organize supplies. Sullivan once gave Klaus an apple, a real apple, crisp and sweet, something Klaus hadn't seen in over a year. The gesture was casual, almost thoughtless on Sullivan's part, but Klaus treasured that apple, eating it slowly over an entire afternoon, savoring each bite like a rare delicacy. Afternoons brought free time. Boys played makeshift games with whatever materials they could scavenge: cards fashioned from cardboard boxes, dice carved from wood scraps, simple ball games using rolled-up rags. The activities felt absurd, given their circumstances, but they provided distraction from thoughts of destroyed homes and uncertain futures. Klaus participated occasionally, but often preferred solitude. He'd find quiet corners where he could think without interruption. He thought about his mother constantly, wondering if she knew he was alive. The camp allowed prisoners to send brief letters home, heavily censored and irregular, but Klaus had written 3 times with no response. He didn't know if his letters ever reached her, or if she was even still in their hometown. He thought about his father less frequently now, though guilt accompanied this realization. His father's death at Stalingrad had once seemed heroic and meaningful. Now Klaus wondered if it had been merely senseless. One more life consumed by a war that served no purpose he could understand. The camp library, such as it was, contained a few dozen books in German, donated by Red Cross organizations. Klaus discovered poetry there, Goethe and Schiller, words from a Germany that existed before destruction. April arrived with news that rippled through the camp like wind through wheat. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. The war in Europe was ending. Prisoners received the information with mixed emotions: relief that the killing would stop, anxiety about what peace meant for defeated Germany, uncertainty about their own futures. Klaus felt strangely numb. The war had defined his entire adolescence. He couldn't remember life without rationing, without propaganda, without fear. Now it was ending not with the promised victory, but with absolute collapse. Everything he'd been taught, every sacrifice demanded, had been for nothing. The camp's atmosphere shifted. Guards became less vigilant, routines more relaxed. Rumors spread about repatriation. Prisoners would be sent home once processing completed and transportation could be arranged. For some, this brought joy. For others, including Klaus, it brought dread. Home meant returning to a country that no longer existed, to cities reduced to rubble, to families that might not have survived. Processing began in early May. Prisoners were interviewed again, evaluated for health, given documentation proving their POW status and reclassification as child soldiers. The Americans were meticulous about paperwork, creating records that might protect former prisoners from future accusations or complications. When Klaus's turn came, he sat across from an American officer and translator, answering familiar questions. Where was home? Who were his family members? What were his plans? Klaus had no plans. He had no idea if his hometown still existed, or if his mother lived. He could only say he would go back and see what remained. The officer nodded sympathetically and stamped documents with official seals. He handed Klaus papers in a weatherproof envelope, speaking through the translator about keeping them safe, about how they proved his status and might be important for future complications. Klaus tucked the envelope inside his jacket, grateful for the foresight even if he couldn't imagine needing such proof. Transportation home came in stages over several weeks. Prisoners were grouped by destination regions and loaded onto trucks that would take them to railway stations, where they'd board trains heading east into the shattered remains of Germany. Klaus's departure date arrived on a cool morning in late May, nearly 3 months after his capture. Before boarding the truck, Klaus returned to his tent one final time. He retrieved the Coca-Cola bottle from beneath his pallet, where it had remained hidden throughout his imprisonment. The glass was scratched now, the label partially torn, but the bottle itself remained intact, a physical reminder of the day his certainty about enemies and punishment had shattered. He wrapped it carefully in cloth and placed it in the small bag of possessions the Americans had given him. Some boys around him were crying, saying goodbye to friendships formed in captivity. Klaus remained quiet, unable to articulate the complex emotions churning inside him. The truck journey was long and silent. German landscape rolled past, forests recovering from winter, fields awaiting cultivation, and everywhere the scars of war. Burned vehicles, destroyed bridges, abandoned military equipment rusting in ditches. This was victory's aftermath, though victory seemed the wrong word for such comprehensive destruction. At the railway station, Klaus boarded a crowded train filled with returning soldiers, refugees, and former prisoners. No one spoke much. Everyone stared out windows at the devastation passing by, processing privately what Germany had become.